He ran away from home at 13 with 5 shillings and a one-eyed horse, 5% of an entire continent. Sidney Kidman built the largest private landholding on the planet, a cattle empire bigger than some nations, and for over a century it stayed in his family. Then in 2015, his own descendants put the whole thing up for sale, and the people with the deepest pockets weren't Australian at all. This is the dark story of the Cattle King, and how his empire was almost lost for good. Number 1. The runaway with 5 shillings. Kapunda, South Australia, 1870. A 13-year-old boy spends a night at the Prince of Wales Hotel, then walks out toward the bush with almost nothing to his name. The legend says he had barely a coin to his name and a one-eyed horse called Cyclops. His father had died when he was a baby, and the man his mother married after that was a violent drunk, so the boy did what his older brother George had already done before him. He left. His brother was managing a cattle station over in New South Wales, and young Sidney went looking for the same kind of escape. Before he even left home, he'd been up before dawn working the Adelaide stockyards for 3 shillings a week. So hard yakka was nothing new to him. He took whatever work the outback would give a kid with no money and no connections. He rode the country for a while with an old nomad herdsman, soaking up the bush. He worked as a roustabout, a bullock driver, a drover, and an odd job boy in a grog shanty for a few shillings a week. When his mother died in 1873, a small inheritance started trickling in from his grandfather's will, and in 1878 he finally got the lot, around £400. For a lot of young men, that money would have vanished into a pub. Kidman turned it into cattle and horses. He set himself up as a carrier and a trader, supplying the rough mining towns springing up across the inland, places like Cobar, Broken Hill and Burra. He opened a butcher's shop at the Cobar Copper Rush and worked out that if you both bought the beast and sold the meat, the profit landed in your pocket twice. In 1886, he bought the first station of his very own, Owen Springs, out past Alice Springs. Plenty of young men who walked into that country with nothing were never heard from again. Kidman was building the beginnings of something the nation had never seen. But the story everyone tells about him, the barefoot battler who tamed the desert, skips over the part that matters most. The country he was conquering was not empty. Someone was already living on every acre of it. Number 2. The chain that beat the drought. Here's what actually made Kidman rich, and it wasn't luck. The inland of Australia is a killer. It doesn't rain for years, and then it floods, and the pattern is close to impossible to predict. Most pastoralists tried to fight that by staying put on one run and praying for rain. Kidman studied the country instead. He worked out that the dry riverbeds threading down through the centre of the continent would fill and green up whenever rain fell somewhere upstream, sometimes hundreds of kilometres away, in country he couldn't even see. So he started buying stations in a deliberate line, a chain of them running north to south along those watercourses, from the good breeding country up near the Gulf, all the way down to the railheads in South Australia. The plan was to fatten cattle on the remote northern runs, then walk them down the chain of stations, feeding and watering them the whole way, so they reached the southern markets in top condition. When drought struck one link, he moved his stock to the next one that still had feed. He called it his back country, and he reinforced it with wells, bores and dams, so a mob could always reach water. That theory got its brutal test in 1901, during the drought they later called the Federation Drought. By one account, around 1 million of Queensland's 4 million cattle died of thirst in that single year. Kidman ran his herds from station to station using telegraphs, scouts and railway timetables, racing to stay ahead of the dying. He'd get word that a river had run somewhere far to the north, and he'd start walking cattle toward the feed before the grass had even properly come up. His empire survived where others were wiped out completely. But even he lost more than 50,000 head in that one drought. And there was a darker edge to how the chain kept growing. When a drought broke his neighbours and left them ruined, Kidman was often the one man still holding cash. He bought their failed stations for next to nothing. A great deal of the empire was assembled out of other people's worst years. Number 3. 500,000 cattle and a slice of a continent. By the time Kidman was finished, the numbers stopped sounding real. When he died in 1935, he owned or controlled around 68 cattle stations, spread across more than 250,000 square kilometres, running more than 600,000 head of cattle and 250,000 sheep. 5% of the whole Australian landmass held or controlled by one family. And by the widest measure, counting every run he owned, part-owned, or had a financial stake in, some accounts put his reach at more than 150 stations covering an area larger than the American state of California. Think about that for a second. One man, who started life with almost nothing, ended up controlling more pastoral land than anyone in modern history. He'd founded the company that carried his name, Kidman Co, back in 1899, and he ran the whole sprawling machine largely from a comfortable house in the Adelaide suburb of Unley Park, using nothing but telegraphs, train timetables, a famously sharp memory, and a small army of stockmen to move herds across distances most people couldn't even picture. He didn't live out on the stations himself. He built 2 great chains of them, one on either side of the interior, reaching almost the length of the continent, and directed the whole thing from the city like a general moving armies he never saw. Every year, the famous Kidman horse sales at Kapunda drew crowds who came just to watch the scale of it. In 1921, he was knighted, partly for the empire and partly for the war. During the First World War, he'd bought aircraft for the military and handed beef to the troops rather than profiteering off the shortage the way plenty of others did. In the papers, he was a national hero, living proof that a poor kid could make good in a young country. The year after he died, a writer named Ion Idris published a best-selling biography and called it, simply, The Cattle King. That was the version of the story that got printed and reprinted for generations. There was another version. It belonged to the people whose land the empire was actually sitting on. Number 4. The people who were already there. Every retelling of the Kidman legend has one figure in it who almost never gets a full sentence. When Kidman was a teenager scraping to survive in the bush, one of the people who kept him alive was an Aboriginal man remembered only as Billy. Billy taught him how to read the country, how to find water, how to track, how to stay alive in land that killed unprepared men in a matter of days. That bush knowledge is a huge part of why Kidman made it when others died trying. And it did not stop with Billy. Right across the empire, the stations ran on the skill and the labour of Aboriginal stockmen, drovers and domestic workers, very often for rations and little or no real wage, under the government controls of the era that dictated where Aboriginal people could live and who they were allowed to work for. The land those stations sat on had belonged to Aboriginal nations for tens of thousands of years before a single Kidman fence went up. Anna Creek, which became the jewel of the whole empire, sits on the country of the Arabana people, who are recognised today as its native title holders, and the entanglement never really ended. As recently as 2014, Kidman cattle were being grazed on Aboriginal-held country in the state's far northwest under adjustment deals, the same old arrangement running on into the present. You would think a story this size would find room for any of that. The hero version never did, and the human cost ran on long after the cattle king himself was gone. One former Kidman station worker, an Aboriginal lawman named Sidney Stewart, ended up dying in police custody, pushing a lawnmower in an outback town where the streets outside were paved with broken glass. Meanwhile, the man who owned it all had never actually lived on his outback stations. He ran them from Adelaide while other people did the work, and the dying out in the heat. Some historians now describe the Great Kidman Sale, a century on, as a kind of second wave of colonisation of the very same country. The empire was never carved out of empty land. It was carved out of somebody's home. Number 5. A cattle station bigger than a country. Let me show you just how big a single piece of this empire got. Anna Creek Station, in the far north of South Australia, is the largest working cattle station on Earth. 8 million acres. That is larger than the entire nation of Israel. It is more than 7 times the size of King Ranch in Texas, the biggest ranch in the United States, and yet it grazes only around 17,000 head of cattle because the land can barely feed more. One small town, William Creek, sits completely surrounded by it, hemmed in on every side by a single private lease. The country is brutal. It bakes to well over 50 degrees in summer and drinks maybe 15 centimetres of rain in a whole year. A mix of red sand hills, swamps and stony gibber plains stretching past the horizon. The nearest town of any size for supplies is the opal mining outpost of Kuba Pedi. The main road in is the Udnadata track, an old dirt route that follows the natural springs that made this brutal country livable in the first place. Out here, the mail comes twice a week on a bush run, and people rely on satellite links just to reach the outside world. To muster a place this big, you don't lean on horses anymore. You send up helicopters and light planes, because a stockman on the ground could ride for days and never reach a boundary fence. You could drop a small European country inside the fence line and still have room to spare, and most of it would never see a human being from 1 month to the next. The station started running sheep back in the 1860s, but the dingoes tore the flocks apart, so the owners switched to cattle. For roughly 100 years, 2 families, the McLeans and the Nuns, ran it as the beating heart of the whole Kidman block. And here's the detail that everyone missed at the time, the one that would matter most. A large part of Anna Creek sits inside the Woomera Prohibited Area, a military weapons testing range so enormous it is the largest of its kind on the planet. For decades, that was just a strange line on a map, cattle grazing beside a missile range. Years later, that overlap would turn Anna Creek into the single most politically radioactive patch of farmland in the country, and it would help decide who was even allowed to buy the Cattle King's empire. Number 6. The empire that outlived the king. For a company most Australians had never really stopped to think about, Kidman Co had staying power that is genuinely rare. Kidman died in 1935, and the empire did not die with him. It kept running, quietly, in the hands of his descendants, decade after decade, while nearly every other great pastoral dynasty in the country was broken up, sold off, or swallowed by someone bigger. At one point, the family's leases, which had been due to expire around the year 2000, were converted into rolling 28-year terms, which is about as close to owning the land forever as a pastoral lease can get. By the 21st century, the company was still around 98% owned by members of the Kidman family, split across 58 separate shareholdings, with relatives living in Australia, Britain, and the United States, and a family fortune valued at more than $300 million. The empire had shrunk a long way from Kidman's personal peak. 3% of Australia's entire land area, which is a staggering figure for one private business. It ran 11 cattle stations across 4 states and territories, well over 150,000 head of cattle, a bull breeding stud and a feedlot, and it fed beef into export markets in Japan, the United States, and across Asia. It employed around 170 people, and it sat among the wealthiest farming families in the country. But the good years were getting harder to come by. In tougher seasons, the herd numbers had slid, and the books had slipped into the red, and some in the family could read the writing on the wall. It had lasted through droughts, world wars, and the whole modern history of the nation. And then, after more than a century and 4 generations, the family that had held on to it decided they were done. Not everyone wanted to sell. They were outvoted. And that single vote set the biggest land sale the country had ever seen in motion. Number 7. The day the family put a continent up for sale. In April 2015, Kidman Co announced it was selling. Not one station, not a few paddocks. The entire holding, all at once. 11 stations, more than 100,000 square kilometres, over 150,000 cattle, the largest private landholding in the country, dropped onto the open market in a single package, valued at around $360 million, with the accountants at Ernst & Young running the sale. The headlines wrote themselves. The world's largest cattle station was up for sale, and so was everything around it. There was nothing else like it on the market anywhere on Earth. You cannot normally walk into a room and buy a piece of a continent. For one strange window, you could. The managing director said the family had simply decided to cash in on strong global demand for Australian farmland. 3% of the whole country, and now every acre of it carried a price tag. It sounded like an ordinary business decision. But putting a landholding that enormous up for grabs in one lump set off something nobody fully saw coming. Because the buyers who could actually afford a prize on that scale were not local farming families coming off a good year. They were overseas investment giants, and more than 600 interested parties would end up circling the sale before it was over. The biggest, most aggressive money of all was coming out of China. By late 2015, the sale had turned into a bidding war between Chinese-linked groups, names like Genius Link and Shanghai Pension, pushing the price up toward $350 million, and a deal looked close to done. Number 8. The bid the government killed. Then the federal government stepped in. In late 2015, the treasurer at the time, Scott Morrison, blocked the sale on national interest grounds, and the reason came straight back to that odd fact about Anna Creek. A large slice of the world's biggest cattle station sat inside the Woomera weapons testing range, the largest land testing range on the planet, and the government decided that letting a foreign buyer own land wrapped around a sensitive defense site was a risk it simply would not take. Morrison put it bluntly. Letting a foreign owner take the empire in its current shape, he said, would be against the national interest. When the bidders were told, every single one of them withdrew their applications. Just like that, a deal worth hundreds of millions was dead. The company's chief executive said he was quite disappointed and somewhat confused, having believed the government's concerns had already been dealt with. The whole process had dragged on for around 18 months, more scrutiny than any rural property deal in the country's history, and the sellers had genuinely thought they were over the line. They weren't. So, to rescue the sale, the sellers took a knife to the package itself. They carved Anna Creek and its outstation, the Peak, right out of the deal, cutting the most sensitive land loose so the rest could still be sold to someone overseas. You would think removing the actual problem would clear the runway. It did the opposite. Because by then, the government's worry had already grown into something far bigger than one missile range. This was no longer about Woomera. It was about how much of Australia a foreign buyer should be allowed to own at all. If you're the kind of person who wants the real story behind the places and empires most Australians have half forgotten, take a second and subscribe, because what the government did next is where this stops being a farm sale and turns into a fight over the whole country. Number 9. We will never sell it to foreigners. In April 2016, a second bid landed, and this one had been engineered to answer every objection. A Chinese-led group called Dakang, working with an Australian partner, offered around $371 million for an 80% stake in the empire. Anna Creek was already gone from the package. The total area on sale had been cut by a quarter, and the share of Australian money in the bid had been lifted to about a fifth. And Morrison blocked that one too. This time his reasoning shifted ground. The problem, he said, was that offering the whole empire as one giant asset made it almost impossible for Australian buyers to compete, and that a single foreign company owning more than 1% of the entire country was just too much to wave through. Critics pounced. Some called it moving the goalposts, a decision that rewrote the national interest test on the fly and effectively brought back a local ownership rule Australia had not had in decades. Outside a handful of sensitive industries like media, the country had not run any formal local ownership rule since 1992. And here it was again, invented on the spot for one company and one very large piece of dirt. Even Andrew Robb, the trade minister at the time, slammed the call as political. But Morrison did not blink. Days later he said out loud what the whole saga had really been about. His government, he said, would never sell Australia's largest cattle empire to foreigners. And that one sentence lit a fire under a much older Australian nerve. How much of the country is already owned from overseas? How much of the farmland, the water, the ground itself, already belongs to someone on the other side of the world? It was a question the country had mostly managed to avoid asking itself. Big stretches of Australian farmland and water rights had already been sold off overseas over the years, a deal at a time, while hardly anyone made a fuss. The Kidman fight dragged all of it into the daylight at once, on the biggest possible stage. The Cattle King's empire had become the centre of a national argument about who is actually allowed to own Australia. Number 10. The deal that saved it, sort of. So who finally got the empire? In December 2016, after almost 2 years, more than 600 interested parties and 2 vetoed sales, the government approved a deal worth around $386 million. The buyer was a joint venture called Australian Outback Beef. 2/3 of it belonged to Hancock Prospecting, the mining company run by Australia's richest person, Gina Rinehart. The other third belonged to a Chinese company, Shanghai Cred. And here's a detail that slipped past most people. The same Chinese company had been part of one of the earlier consortiums, one of the very bids the government had already knocked back. The Chinese money that got rejected the first time was now approved, just in a smaller share. On paper, though, this was the patriotic ending everyone had wanted. The empire would be majority Australian-owned, run by an Australian magnate, and the politicians could stand up and say they had protected it. This time, with the Chinese share cut down and an Australian billionaire in charge, the government waved it through. After 2 years, hundreds of bidders, and a national shouting match, the whole thing was finally done. Reinhardt called Kidman an iconic business built by an outstanding Australian and pledged to grow it, promising 20,000 more head of cattle within 18 months, up to $19 million in improvements, and 35 new full-time jobs. And the crown jewel was protected most of all. Anna Creek and the Peak, the land tangled up with Woomera, was sold off on their own for around $16 million to the Williams family, South Australian graziers who farmed right next door and who doubled their own holdings overnight. The world's largest cattle station stayed firmly in Australian hands. Even stripped of Anna Creek, what the consortium took on still ran to around 77,700 square kilometres of the country. It looked like a tidy, happy ending for everyone who had spent 2 years panicking about a foreign takeover. But look closely at that ownership split, and it gets a lot messier. Number 11. The new cattle queen. There is something almost too fitting about who ended up on the cattle king's throne. The man himself built his empire out of cattle, drought and saddle leather. The person who inherited the heart of it made her fortune digging iron ore out of the ground. Reinhardt is a mining magnate, the richest person in the country, and with the Kidman deal, she became one of the largest agricultural landholders in Australia almost overnight. Her company had already been buying up cattle country across northern Australia for years. Bolt the Kidman stations onto that, and the combined empire she and her Chinese partner controlled stretched toward 12 million hectares, reaching into every mainland state, one of the biggest cattle footprints assembled in a single hand in generations. A mining billionaire now sat on the cattle king's throne, and she did not buy it to let it sit. Reinhardt poured money and ambition into the business, talking about knitting it together with her northern properties and building a diversified cattle operation to rival anything the country had ever run. She had cash the cattle king never dreamed of, and the same hunger for scale. For a moment it looked like the old empire might actually grow bigger than it had been in decades, instead of shrinking. That is not how it went. Because within just a few years, the woman who fought so hard to win the cattle king's empire would start selling it off, one piece at a time. Number 12. What Australian hands really means. Here is the detail that got lost in all the celebration. After every veto, all the outrage, and the Treasurer's public promise never to sell the empire overseas, the final approved deal still handed a full third of the Cattle King's company to a foreign owner. The business ended up around 34% foreign-owned, and everyone signed off on it. The government had never actually promised zero foreign ownership. What it drew was a much softer line. Overseas money was fine, just not too much of it, and not the paddocks wrapped around a missile range. That is a very different promise from the one the headlines had made all year. And there is a deeper irony sitting underneath the entire fight, one that hardly anyone said out loud at the time. Politicians spent 2 years arguing about keeping the land in Australian hands, as though the land had always been Australian to begin with. But this empire was built on the country of Aboriginal nations who were never asked and never paid, worked by Aboriginal stockmen who were often handed rations instead of wages. Anna Creek, the very piece everyone fought hardest to protect, sits on Arabana country to this day, and the Arabana are its recognised native title holders. The whole 2-year fight to protect the empire happened on land whose first owners were never once at the table. So strip the flags away, and the argument was never really about whether the country would stay in Australian hands. It was about which non-Aboriginal owner would hold it next. Number 13. The empire sold off piece by piece. And here is the part that might be the darkest of all, because it is still happening right now. Once Reinhardt's company took control of the empire that took the Cattle King a lifetime to build, it started taking it apart. Since 2016, Kidman Co has been steadily selling off the very stations that made it a legend. By 2023, it had offloaded so many properties that the company was down to just 4 pastoral leases, 1 in the Northern Territory and 3 in Queensland, having raised somewhere around $200 million along the way. 4 survivors, out of an operation that once ran dozens of stations. The focus shifted from the vast old cattle runs toward high-end Wagyu beef. In 2025, the company spent around $36 million on a very different kind of property, a green, well-watered station called Jindabyne in New South Wales, to breed premium cattle, calling the whole move a reformation of the business. The empire that once stretched across a slice of the continent is being quietly dismantled, station by station, sold to whoever will pay, and hardly anyone is watching it happen. There were no headlines for this part. No treasurer stood up to defend it. The stations that a government once fought to protect are being let go one at a time, and the country that panicked about losing them to China barely looked up. Then comes the final twist, and it is almost too neat to be true. In early 2026, the company put another large Queensland holding up for sale, and one of the reasons it gave was a state tax aimed squarely at foreign landowners, a bill running to about $1 million a year. Read that again. The empire a government fought for 2 years to keep Australian is now selling off land, partly because it gets taxed as foreign-owned. The cattle king spent his whole life building this thing up. A century on, it is being pulled apart in pieces. So think back to that 13-year-old on the road out of Kapunda, 5 shillings to his name and a one-eyed horse under him. He built something so vast that a government would one day fight to keep it out of foreign hands. The saga left a mark that outlasted the deal, too. It forced the country to actually count how much of its farmland and water already answered to owners overseas, and a lot of Australians did not love the answer. But the empire was never really one man's, and it was never only Australia's to lose. It was taken before it was ever built, held for a century, fought over for 2 years, and now it is slipping away again, one station at a time, while the country that argued so loudly about owning it looks the other way. If you want to see another Australian giant that vanished while everyone was looking somewhere else, that story is on your screen right now.